Welcome everyone to today's webinar. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Crystal Sheasley, Program Manager at the New England Environmental Finance Center. We're part of the Water Infrastructure Capacity Building team, which is hosting today's session. And our team is one of 6 funded through the HUD EPA Capacity Building for Sustainable Communities program. We're providing technical assistance to recipients of grants from the Federal Partnership for Sustainable Communities, and that's all of you. And our work involves helping these communities integrate water infrastructure, planning, and investments into your larger planning processes and programs. We're really delighted to be hosting this session today, Introduction to COAST, a tool for community-led climate adaptation planning. Before I introduce our speaker, just a couple pieces of housekeeping. Your phone lines, participant lines, are muted to minimize disturbance. We'll be taking questions at the end. We'll try to save the last 10 or 15 minutes or so for this. So as we go, if any questions or comments occur to you, you can feel free to chat them into the chat box, which you should see at the bottom right hand of your screen if you're joined online. And you can select that your question be visible to everyone or just to me. I'll be collecting the questions and moderate that session, the Q&A at the end. And if you want us to know where you're calling from, just be sure to include your town or your organization in your comments. This session is being recorded, and it will be archived on the Sustainable Communities Learning Network website. And I'll send that link around after the session is over, probably early next week. So if you're joining today and you didn't pre-register and you want to get that link, just send me a message through the chat box with your name and email, and I'll be sure that you get that. So a huge thank you to today's speaker, Dr. Sam Merrill. Sam is the director of the New England Environmental Finance Center, associate research professor at the University of Southern Maine, and president of the consulting firm Catalysis Adaptation Partners. Sam has a range of environmental finance-related experience in the private and nonprofit sectors. His research interests include the fiscal and policy connections between land conservation and development in New England, and developing tools for financial adaptation to sea level rise. He's worked with local officials, conservation leaders, developers, and others on a variety of topics, including consensus building for acquisition of local land use and cost-benefit of visualization software for evaluating adaptation responses to sea level rise and storm surge in coastal areas. And that's the piece that he'll be talking to us about today. We're really excited to hear about COAST. So, Sam, thank you again, and I will hand it over to you.
We have the pleasure of having heard some of the questions early on. People, when they registered for the webinar, said, well, I'd really like to learn about this or that. I thought I'd tick off just a couple of those to set the stage a little bit. There are 4 in particular. I'll just brisk through a couple of them. One was, so about this COAST tool, which stands for Coastal Adaptation to Sea Level Rise Tool, there was a question about some NOAA documents and products out there, like that there's this new guide that says, what will adaptation cost? And the question was, well, so where does COAST fit in and all of that and with NOAA and its other tools? Well, so first of all, COAST is actually in that document. There's a whole appendix about it and use of it. I worked carefully with NOAA on that and development of it and integration with it. Second, the body of the text has a big section on development of depth damage functions that I'll be talking about here in this hour. And that's actually describes some of the mathematics behind the COAST shell itself, so that where people could go in and do it manually themselves if they wanted, or they could use the COAST tool. Third, again, that just I did work carefully with NOAA on that and have in development of the tool for a while. Second question was, how is it different from the slosh modeling and many of the other tools out there? It's a long talk, and I can say there are at least 6 major distinguishing characteristics between COAST and a suite of other tools that are out there. I just mentioned 3. One is 3D visualization, and that's free in Google Earth. 2 is the ability to do comparisons between benefits and costs of no-action scenarios versus taking different adaptation actions, as I'll illustrate. And 3 is really it's all about process. It's very much of a stakeholder-driven model, as I'm going to explain. The third question was, can we look at the difference and tease out the difference between impacts of sea level rise and storm surge? And the answer is yes. I'll give an example of that or two. And fourth, finally, can we look at inland flooding? And the answer is yes. We're doing quite a lot inland Minnesota, some storm surge issues, and also we're developing a drought model that would be for the American Southwest using some of the same algorithms. So just an overview, trying to get at some of those. But any other questions you may have as I'm speaking, please go ahead and send them on in, and we'll have a discussion after. And I have no time constraints here, too, so if it happens to run over and people want to stay and chat, that's just fine as well. So let's just jump right in. And I'm going to start with an assertion here, which is that I don't actually think we need more tools to this question about tools. A lot of people are saying, so what are the lessons from Hurricane Sandy? People say, well, it was widespread and had cross-sectoral impacts and so on. But I don't think those are really lessons. You know, some people say, okay, so we need better tools to help us predict. Well, let's look at that as an assumption. I'm not sure that's true. Here's a picture of New York just before Hurricane Sandy hit, and a prediction in yellow of how far inland a storm the size of Sandy would come. Now we'll go to the next slide and show you how far inland Sandy actually came in blue. So we had a pretty good idea of how vulnerable we were. In fact, that's accurate down to some pretty small areas. We don't need more tools is my general assertion. We need more conversation in local government, and especially about what kind of action are we going to take. So that's what this whole framework is going to be about. Now, what I'm describing has been developed over the last 7 or 8 years here at the Muskie School of Public Service through several organizations funded mostly by EPA, with software work done by Blue Marble, and with a lot of participating organizations in beta testing all around. But applied work of the tool is now happening mostly through the private sector, through this firm, Catalysis Adaptation Partners. And there's a lot of it. It's now, what I'm going to be describing has now happened or is happening in all of these local governments at least, and many, many others actually at the federal level. I'll describe a couple of these. We're starting a federal highway job down in Broward County in Florida, also with federal highway in the state of Minnesota. Again, as I mentioned, we have state projects with bridges in the state of Maine and elsewhere. We're just going international now through a National Science Foundation award to the University of South Florida. We're going to be working in Sarasota County, but not just there, also overseas in London and in Santos, Brazil, just outside of Sao Paulo. And there are many, many others domestically coming on that are small communities like this that are starting to use and see the benefits of this kind of approach I'll be describing. And again, that's all happening through the firm Catalysis now, although others are free to use this approach. So what is the approach? It is, it is very technical, you know, for all I was saying about we don't need more tools. It is a tool, and there are formulas and mathematics behind it. This is one of the papers with some of the algorithms. It was published by Paul Kirshen and others, where you could look up some of these if you wanted. And it is a software program that when you download it has dialog boxes and pull-down menus and things. And it is a versioned tool that, as I mentioned, we're doing more work on it now. New versions will be coming out on an ongoing basis, and those will continue to be free downloads online. And I should say that in developing it, we've really focused mostly on the psychology. We've started with looking at why we've had such a problem. We've been talking about the need to be taking action for 15 or 20 years here or more, but it's hard to take action for at least these reasons. We think we have a lot of time, but we may not. We say 30 or 50 years, but think Hurricane Sandy. You know, or number two, we don't know how much bang for our buck we're buying with different mitigation actions, and that's unclear. Number three, the actions we might take are themselves complex. We're really not clear what we mean by a rolling easement or wet floodproofing sometimes. These aren't things that are in the common vocabulary yet. And finally, doing nothing kind of works. It's actually easier, and it's what you'd expect if all we can really do is show people two-dimensional inundation maps of just how wet they're going to get without helping them step through options for themselves. Because, however, there really are only these options on a per-asset basis, and that's important. You need to be talking about real estate or jobs or natural resources or infrastructure or something else, vulnerable demographic groups, for example. You can either fortify, meaning modify the flow of water, accommodate, meaning modify the impact of the water, think here elevation or floodproofing, or relocate, and that might be through rezoning or acquisition or other things. And COAST, the whole thing is really a way to help groups evaluate costs and benefits of these options. and navigate through that psychological nexus. And I say psychological because this is really our focus. We're looking at the fact that there's a lot of fear and uncertainty out there. You can see a little bit in this man's eyes here. It's a Dutchman behind their famed levee complex that's now leaking under the combined weight of more surge and sea level rise, and he's hoping his windows will hold. Maybe he's looking confident. I'm not sure, but here in this country we don't see events like this terribly much, but you can sense that uncertainty and fear out there. And so this whole process is really about recognizing and harvesting and harnessing that fear and converting it into civic engagement for these options, because we see that we've all often said and known that the problem and the opportunity of these sea level rise and storm surge issues is at the juncture of social, economic, and political forces. But this whole approach is organized around the notion that harvesting these emotional currents is what is going to help create action, and that's what we're seeing happening all around, and why I think there's so many of these new projects starting up. So, since I'm saying it is about people, let's jump right in. The process is, first, we engage stakeholders, and they drive. This is central. This is critical to the whole thing. People determine their own thresholds of risk, sensitivity, and tolerance, and that's a neutral and facilitated process. So, as an extension agent or a company or whoever is going to be working with the community, we would present them with, say, a suite of best available science, recent peer-reviewed estimates of how much sea level rise there might be out over the next century, and then they pick. If they think that the Greenland ice sheet's going to melt, well, okay, they might pick one range or another, and we'd help step them through figuring that out. Or if it's, say, in North Carolina, where there was a lot of discussion last year about, well, maybe we should only be looking at projections that would be straight off of the tide gauge from the last century. That would be a more conservative estimate, and okay, we could work with that. We're not going to advocate for particular modeling outcomes or structures. This is stakeholder-driven. And if they were to pick this one, Vermeer and Ramsdorf, about the fifth or sixth one over, that curve would look like this. What's a current? Still a little bit internationally accepted academic standard, and those black arrows are how much sea level rise we would program into the model. And similarly with storm surge, we program how vulnerable people think they are. How big of a storm do they want to protect themselves against? We can use those flood extents from people's memory and from the tide gauge. And we can derive those probabilities and surge extents both from FEMA flood insurance studies, which are available in most locations, or where they're not, or they're insufficient, we can do time series analysis off the tide gauge and come up with our own probabilistic estimates. And that works too. There are other ways to do it, but most importantly, it is stakeholder-driven. People agree on how much impact they want to model. And again, then, people select the vulnerable asset. Do they want to look at real estate or economic activity? We've published in quite a lot of these areas already, and many of the projects are underway in the others, and there are many different ways to do it. Now, once that's done, you can go ahead and merge, or rather input, the depth damage function, and this is critical to the whole thing. I referenced it at the outset, that it's in that very NOAA document. And what it does is it says what percent of an asset's value is going to be lost at different depths of inundation. Now, for real estate, for example, this is quite a robust function. It's based on millions of insurance claims, which say, on average, how much a structure is likely to lose in value for different depths of inundation. And you merge that with the spatial representation of that asset layer and the elevation layer in a GIS, and you can then create, when you run the model, it will actually estimate the dollar damage for a size storm and project those in 3D maps and calculate the cumulative damage for all storms out to that year. Those are different processes mathematically, but you do both at once and you get these different results that help out to go forward. So I'm going to give a little case study here, quick summary up to this point of what this part of the process looks like here in Kingston, New York, a place we did this earlier this year. Final report just went in last week, we can do this relatively quickly. Here in the top are the scenarios that those stakeholders decided they wanted to look at, and this is their lovely downtown. There's a gazebo in the downtown, and you can look at that from the air. Here is the gazebo from the air along this shoreline, which is about 85 miles upstream from New York City. They didn't think they were terribly vulnerable from storm. This is a little tributary off the Hudson. But, a few years ago, they got really clobbered by Hurricane Irene. There's that same downtown strip. looking off the bridge, right, where it was several feet of water right on the main street, and they hadn't been prepared for it. They went and they had a seawall around the wastewater treatment plant, and they thought they'd be safe. But then Hurricane Sandy hit just 14 months later, and the surge was 11 foot. The seawall around the wastewater treatment plant was only 10. So it was a big problem. And they were very interested in engaging in new kinds of discussions. And so we did some modeling there for this to show what this output looks like. Here's an actual extrusion where those blue boxes will show you how much dollar value is lost at each spot. And you can click on each one and see how much depth there is and the amount of dollar loss. And that's 2013 with no sea level rise. So if we add some years and go out to 2060 with high sea level rise, you'll see there's more damage and more depth at each of these sites, and more of the parcels start getting hit because the same size surge will come farther in when you add sea level rise. Now, if we go out even farther, say 2100, it's very interesting what happens. It goes even farther in, but you don't see bigger, taller blue boxes. Actually, you see what we have here are flat brown boxes. And that's because at a certain point, those parcels become permanently inundated. And it's not reasonable to go ahead and leave that dollar value of the asset there from then on. What if that had happened in the year 2065? You wouldn't keep tallying all of those losses. That parcel will either be adapted or abandoned. And adapted could be elevated or relocated, but the point is the dollar value is no longer vulnerable to be compromised in the same way. So what you do is we remove that from the vulnerable asset data layer, and that, of course, influences your calculations of how much loss there will be, but that's the way the model is structured. It works on an annual basis with all probabilities of events out through the century, and it operates that way. And you can still tell, what the total depth is, how much total loss there was, and when that abandonment or adaptation happened for any given parcel. Now, that's all the no-action scenario, and that was one scenario where on the left here you have the amounts of impact that the stakeholders selected, and on the right you have the cumulative expected damages with net present value and other issues that other quantifications that the stakeholders wanted to see. And that's for as if you've done nothing, right? And then we can start saying, what might we want to do? And then we'll compare the benefits and costs of taking those actions versus doing nothing. But this is when we go ahead and select the candidate actions over time. And that can be a suite of hard structures and approaches, like on the left we've modeled, published on most of these, and on the right as well. And it's very, very different for different ways of doing it, depending on local public process and regulatory issues and so on. And there's a lot involved at this stage in terms of public process. It's very careful and sensitive and nuanced. It needs to be quite neutral. And you need to talk a lot about trade-offs and help people do that, where here you might go ahead and build a hard structure like a revetment, which can be great at protecting things like a historic district, say, but it's going to push water and sand next door and probably compromise a neighboring wetland, perhaps piping plover habitat or who knows what. And it's just this kind of a trade-off discussion that people suddenly have an opportunity to have. And that's a facilitated process, and it ends up making the results more robust. But again, this is important because it's stakeholder-driven. It provides whoever's structuring the process a certain amount of insurance, I guess I would say a buffer, if you will, from the local politics, because since it's truly neutral, citizens own the inputs, they own the outputs, and there's nobody to get angry about what it says. These are their decisions. It's operating in service of their dilemmas that they're trying to solve, and that's a distinguishing feature between this tool and approach with many of the others that are out there, as I said on the first slide. So what we then actually do is for each of those candidate actions, we modify the depth damage function or the spatial distribution of the asset to show as if that action had happened. And then we rerun the model and we look at those different numbers. So here's one example where in Kingston, there's that same vulnerable area. They decided to look at this, which was a road. They said, well, let's elevate that road 11 feet, treat it like a seawall. Or we could build this thing right here, another thing on the shore. That's called a bulkhead. They wanted to build that there. Or they wanted to look also at a rolling easement where title would transfer to the city once sea level rise had gotten to a certain level. So we have these three adaptation options that we wanted to go through and look at those for them. And here are the scenarios elevation of the road and elevation of the bulkhead and the rolling easements. Now, what we have here is row 1 is total damage if you do nothing, all across row 1. Row 2 is total damage if you have the adaptation strategy in place, cumulative for all events. Number 3 is the difference between them, which is the avoided cost or the benefit of having taken action. Row 4 is the cost of the strategy itself, and there's a lot to these numbers. There's a lot of engineering detail in columns 1 and 2 on how those were derived. Won't go into it, but every place has its own level of sophistication about these things, whatever is robust enough for that local process. And scenario D, for example, on these costs, there's a lot that went into that. I'll say a little bit more about politics next slide, but punchline is you get these benefit-cost ratios for low and high sea level rise scenarios. And people can say, oh, we want to go with this one because it'll save the most money. Well, maybe they'll end up going with this one even though it's not as cost efficient, because these are about values, and that's again a facilitated process. But here on the rolling easement, it was very interesting politically to see that the town decided to not elevate the road or bulkhead. If they're going to do the rolling easement, which is that funds would go to landowners now for title that wouldn't transfer for decades, but the city would be choosing to not do other things. You would not armor. And the owner could not then armor. They're actually making a choice. Remember, the point was that we're helping people navigate among fortify, accommodate, and relocate. And when you make one choice, you're choosing not to do another thing. Now, that's not to say this was easy to reach this alternative as a modeling scenario, because it was not. In fact, the people who suggested this one in the process got a lot of pushback from the people who are advocating for fortify and building the bulkhead, and vice versa. The people who wanted that one had pushback from these very people looking at the easement. So it's a careful public process that needs to be structured. But finally, once you have these results, you can actually go ahead and navigate through what are we going to actually do. This has been the big problem, getting from planning to implementation. We can go ahead and start implementing when people own the results and see what the policy and finance levers need to be, because they've developed them. I'm going to give a few examples. But first, I'm going to go up to the stratosphere for a moment and talk about places we're using this in other areas, higher level stuff with main bridges, where our governor, who doesn't happen to think climate change is much happening, frankly, is still the governor and responsible for his infrastructure. And he's asking the reasonable question for all our thousands of miles of coastline in this state, how big of a storm does it make financial sense for me to build a bridge to protect myself? Should I build a $5, a $12, or a $20 million bridge? We're using the software to help him with that question, and doing very similar things in Broward County, Florida, and in Minnesota. And transit, I should just mention, and by the way, I'm going to come back down to a couple more community level issues shortly, and some lessons learned on the politics, and then we'll go into discussion. But a couple more higher level pieces. First, on transit, I was flown to D.C. I spoke at Congress this summer, where they had just approved $20 million for Manhattan, for New York City to be floodproofing and things post Sandy, and I was there. They were asking this similar reasonable question: what's a good investment? And I was helping them think through some of those things in some congressional briefings. But so for example, they're thinking about tunnel plugs in the subway, new technology that could end up protecting the subways from going down. They would self-inflate. Or these things which are floodgates, which could go over subway entrance, and that's the engineering design there. They go up without people or power, just a quarter inch of water, and they can raise. It's a very elegant design. You can see here in a flood, there's a car. It is actually a flood, and it went up, and the places back here stayed dry. They work, and they're flying off the shelf now. This is a new technology, and you could do that in New York over all the subway entrances. It's expensive, but is that a good investment? That's the kind of work that we're doing. Similarly, in New York, the rail yards, 207th Street Yard, we're looking at with an engineering firm right now, Parsons Brinkerhoff, where they are lucky they didn't get clobbered by Sandy. They were exposed, but they're thinking about a seawall in here to protect it. And the question is, how tall should that be? Every additional foot of seawall will cost a certain amount, and we can show the relative risk mitigation, bang for your buck, of each additional foot increment. That's the kind of analysis we're doing in some of these other projects. And similarly, we've just started a project with Logan Airport and have others going on. So many of these places are built on fill, and they need to know, should we build berms or dikes or jetties or elevate or what? What are we going to do? That's what this is for. Okay, back down to the community level. Portland, Maine, we did one where, boy, we have a lot of saltwater issues. We're getting a foot of salt water in some places at high tide. We really are having high tides that just show up. We should not be having cars and boats at the same elevation here with our high tides. That's 3-6 inches of water down the waterfront and many, many other areas. So there's some regular issues now, and people are really talking about it a lot. When storm surge comes along, it even gets worse. They decided for their modeling to go ahead and look at fortification as the approach. They wanted to look at this cove here and putting a big old hurricane barrier underneath it right there. That might cost about $100 million, and a big levee complex with several different levee structures in it around there for another $40 million or so. And we did pay an engineering firm to do these estimates. And they picked these same sea level rise extents from Vermeer and Ransdorf, the earlier numbers happened to be. And just quickly, it looked like this, an extrusion out to the year 2050, high sea level rise, 100-year storm, where the blue extrusions show how much dollar loss you might expect from that event. And that's a stakeholder-derived scenario. And total damage was about $141 million. Maximum height, this one there, was over $16 million for that one parcel. Oh, and incidentally, this was not all present-day real estate. This was as if built out, because we knew where the city is planning to put its commercial real estate, and so we assigned hypothetical assessed values to a whole lot of those parcels with the planners and discounted it appropriately with net present value over time and nuanced it that way to reflect land use change. And what we can anticipate will be in harm's way, and what are we going to do about it? And similarly, you can go in and right-click on any of these parcels and find out the dollar values of these things. And, importantly, then you can compare your no action to your action scenarios, where with no action, even with no sea level rise, you'll have over $300 million of loss, but you've spent no money. Your damage is $356. But if you have built that hurricane surge barrier for $100 million, you'll only see $100 million in loss. So good benefit cost ratio here, and that does increase over increasing sea level rise. Now, if you go out to 2100 then, what I've done here is shown these red parcels underneath. Those are the amounts of damage from sea level rise itself. In this case, they're extruded. In the earlier ones I was showing, they were brown, they were flat. But here it's just to show kind of a relative contribution. And going back to the tallies then, in 2100, your benefits and costs actually increase quite a bit because you've seen a lot more damages and you're starting from a higher level with more sea level rise each time. So you're justifying more of these costs. And by the way, here, it's also interesting to show, here I have barrier plus levee, whereas you saw before I was only showing surge barrier. Point being that in this one out to 2050, there were no damages from sea level rise yet. The curve hadn't hit the coast. So you don't need to build that levee. Save your $40 million until 2051 at least, and then build it here. That's why that extra $40 million is in here. So this helps you think through when it makes sense to make which kind of investments and why. Similarly in Groton, running out of time, I guess I'll skim through this one, except to say this was about a surge barrier we modeled for Groton, Connecticut in a commercial district. Also looked at elevation and fortification, but this figure of results makes a similar point if you read the figure down for increasing amounts of sea level rise and more frequent storms and surges. They're more intense over time, and you make certain investments. You make one now, it would protect you up to this level of inundation by building that hurricane barrier. If you've bonded for it, okay, maybe by the time you've paid off that bond 20 years later, sea level will have gone up and you can do some other things. So again, it's making the point that you can use this analytic framework to look at when it makes sense to make which kind of investments and why. One more case study and then I'll wind up. Coastal New Hampshire, we looked in 3 towns where there were this suite of public assets, and we were able to figure out, just based on elevation extents, not a full coast iteration proper analytically, when they're likely to get hit by different amounts of sea level rise and flooding. And everybody was very glad to see that the nuclear power plant, Sundai, wasn't going to get hit till after 2100. There's actually a picture of the power plant staying dry, even in the worst case scenario. But if you look at the coast scenarios, then here are those 3 towns. It was great to see them working together. There's a lot of regionalism issues coming out to play. I could go into that another time. But here, these red extrusions are dollars lost, again, from sea level rise, and blue is from storm and surge. And we'll just zoom in on this one over here. Actually, there's another one behind it. You can't quite see. It's this one, Hampton, New Hampshire. This was the fire station in Hampton. And what I wanted to say here was it's very interesting to see, because it gets into the politics again and the local stakeholder-driven issues of it, that it was they wanted to model, putting up some steel floodgates and barriers around the fire station to protect themselves. And we modeled that and the costs and benefits of doing that, and it looked like about a 12 to 1 or 16 to 1 dollar value ratio if you do that. Now, it was great to see. I remember presenting these results in public meeting, and the town fire chief in Hampton was there, and I'll never forget, he said, okay, so that's great, but, well, I guess that's a no-brainer, really, so let's forget about the numbers. We're going to do that. But my question is, how are we going to get our squad cars out in the event of a flood? Which launched immediately this whole new comprehensive overhaul planning subcommittee process to start looking at E911 revision in the event of a flood, to the point that it really, the numbers don't matter so much, hence the name of the firm, Catalysis. We're really about starting conversations. They took those results and they used their civic engagement, which had just been created. Remember, it was harvesting that uncertainty and converting it to civic engagement, and they went and they launched their own process. And that was self-fueling and continues with their ongoing adaptation process with ordinance review and other things. So it's that suddenly they were all able to make connections. We are all, these are interconnected, nested subsystems. We're not going to solve one thing at once. COAST is great because it goes very, very deep into one asset and one action. But at the same time, it uses that framework to help people launch out and make connections to all the other nested, interconnected vulnerabilities. And how are we going to take a systemic approach to this? It's a different way to do it, and that's another distinguishing characteristic of the process. Finally, in this example, we also modeled private residences on the shore. This was, that is actually the fire station here. A zoom in at the shore just underneath them. These are all family heirloom residences that are going to get clobbered by storm surge. Most of them won't get hit by sea level rise until 2100 in the red, but all these are going to lose a lot of money from surge. And so they had asked us to model a zoning action as their adaptation response. It was going to be including putting in 3-foot elevation of freeboard, so that when you get hit by a storm, you'll have to elevate 3 feet. That would be a rule. They wanted to model a regulatory response. Okay, so we did that, and sure enough, here are the results. Great cost-benefit results. Yeah, that'll save a lot of money if you do it. Immediately in public process, I remember again people were saying, well, who's going to pay for that, right? Then the how to pay question comes up. And this gets into the role of the Environmental Finance Center Network too, the motto of which, by the way, nationwide is helping communities answer the how to pay questions of providing environmental services, one of which is resiliency, of course. And here we are, the people saying, well, how are we going to pay for that? Well, right, it might cost 30 or 40 grand to elevate my house when I get clobbered. Who's going to pay? And it was a very conservative person in the room that brought this up to make the point that this avoids climate change politics. This gets to people's own sense of their own vulnerabilities and what they want to do about it, and it helps them take their own action. So they said that. Somebody else said, well, how about we create like a common pool of resources where everybody invests, and we'll, then when you get clobbered, you can just tap the fund to elevate for the 30 or 40 grand. And the other person, who again was conservative, said, well, yeah, that's like socialism. That's like the government taking my money and giving it to somebody else. I'm not going to do that. Go away. Well, the first person, who was also conservative, said, well, all right, so you don't have to invest in the fund, but then you wouldn't be able to elevate when you get hit. And the first one took a long pause and said, oh, all right, so I guess I do want my grandkids to have this house. So okay, let's talk about it. Not that innovation has been implemented yet, but the point is it created a window of opportunity that was self-generated, and I know from experience, you all probably know as well, that people, extension agents, government folks can't go in and tell people to do things like this. You can't provide these solutions for them. It's like pushing rope. We've been doing it for decades. We need to do something else, and I believe it's about helping people self-generate the solutions. It's only then that they'll be robust enough to make it through the social and political process of actually pulling the finance and policy implementation levers. So with that, I would just say that some of the lessons learned here, again, debates over climate change can be avoided. People know these things are happening. I could tell so many stories of conservatives who engage with this process because it's about them and about their stuff and the things they care about, their public landings where they put in their bass boats, and they don't want to see those things wash away, and on and on. And the analogy that often comes up is actually that it's sort of like house robbery. If you're robbed, if you're burglarized, you're probably going to put locks on your door, or you're going to get a security system. You're not going to sit around. You might even move. You're not going to sit around and argue for decades over the causes of the high crime rate in your area. It's not relevant anymore. It's just not about that. So I don't even use the phrase climate change in most of these things. In fact, it's not even in the contract with a lot of places. It's not about that. It's about fiscal efficiency and wise choices, and what is society going to do about these problems that keep coming every year, much more frequently than people have been predicting. Finally, citizens do want places to get beyond the vulnerability studies and start taking action, but they see that it's going to take a lot of money, and that means that they recognize a certain amount of consensus is going to be necessary. It creates a certain amount of willingness, even if unconscious, to engage with these very, very difficult conversations. And COAST, as an approach, can help create the consensus. And again, just like I mentioned in Kingston, they might not end up picking the most cost-effective one. Maybe they will want to go forward with the rolling easement because the values discussion will have been had properly and become socially robust. And with that, I would just wind down, except to say here is a website where you can download the free software. There's a user's manual and tutorial data sets. It will take you to the site of Blue Marble Geographics, where you can go ahead and get the tool and all of that and learn how to use it. And as I mentioned, we're making many changes to it on an ongoing basis. I'm adding multiple depth damage function capability right now, staged adaptation costing over time, some nuanced net present value work for the economists out there, and many other bells and whistles are being added, sort of like Microsoft Word, where, if you remember, you couldn't even copy and paste with it when version 1 came out, but everybody still needed it, and COAST is seeming to serve a similar role where even version 1, which is out, is useful. Version 2 will be out by the end of the year. And then for applied uses of the approach, you can contact me at the bottom if you wanted to see about our group being involved. I should mention I'm actually going to be doing this full-time. I'm leaving the university at the end of this very month after a long career as an academic and agency person. There's so much going on, so many projects are beginning, as I've described, that I need to be there full-time just to manage them, and we are expanding and hiring rapidly to respond to all this interest. So all of that is happening. Just as one example, since I saw there were a number of people on the register from Florida, I wanted to mention this one event as my very last slide, where there's a week-long conference at Florida Atlantic University where we've added on an extra day. Conference organizers have set this up where there's going to be a full-day workshop. It's a clinic event, and anybody who's down there or anybody else is welcome to, of course, go. It's going to be interesting where there's this brand new tool from Climate Central. It's been out for a while. Version 1 has, called Surging Seas. Version 2.0 is coming out right now, and they're going to do the first part of the day, and the whole second half is going to be interactive. It's very different. It's going to have a dozen towns and representatives are going to show up, and each have 20 minutes in kind of a fishbowl setting on a stage with maybe a couple hundred people around, all listening to the consultations and discussions about using this approach in their towns in Florida. And we've let's see, maybe Del Rey, maybe West Palm Beach. There are some others we're talking with. There'll be a dozen that we have all set up, and those are going to be interactive. So it's discussions with the large group while we do the consultation, setting things up, and anybody's, of course, welcome to participate. We're probably going to do several of these around the country as part of our rollout. So with that, I think I will wind down and just turn over for questions if it can be tailored to any of these particular interests that I haven't covered. Thank you, Crystal.
Thank you, Sam. And we have had a couple of questions come in. I'll read those out to you, but feel free to chat into the chat box any additional questions that you have that occur to you. So there have been a couple questions. Sam, you addressed this right at the start of the call really briefly, but there have been a couple questions about the applications of coast in non-coastal areas, so inland, issues with riverine flooding based on seasonal, more frequent and severe storm events. Someone else asked about drought. So can you talk more about the applications of coast in those types of scenarios?
Sure. Well, the thing about the coast framework, really all it is, it's taking an anticipated environmental threat in the future, which usually is represented as a polygon, and overlaying it onto some vulnerable asset. You tally up the dollar value of that vulnerable asset in various probabilistic conditions out over time, and you get representations of that cost, and then the avoided cost of having done something to change that. Now, as long as you can say something reasonable about the spatial distribution and probability of that threat, then you can run this model. Now, so for example, in drought scenarios, there are drought polygons out there and there are fire polygons out there where you could say in Colorado, how vulnerable are these houses? How likely are they to get burned? There's a proposal in right now with NOAA, and many other conversations are underway with foundations and others about building a drought version of this, which is called DUST, the Drought Understanding Strategy Tool, that uses the same mathematics, the same architecture, and it just swaps over to different vulnerable assets and different threats. But the whole front end of the software is structured around these things. And we have communities that are waiting for us to do this with them once the funds are in place, which is underway. In terms of the American Southwest and drought conditions, that's the answer. But also inland, so if it's flooding, like I mentioned Minnesota, and bridge work we're going to be doing, that would be from Lake Superior, where you just have different flooding polygons in your GIS that you're similarly overlaying over different vulnerable assets, and it's probably similar depth damage functions, but they're different probability curves about the likelihood of those events, because it's not storm surge from the ocean or analysis off your tide gauge. It's a different setup, right, analytically. With that said, there's one more thing to say about going inland, is that it doesn't have to be a polygon that you would overlay. Again, remember, I said as long as you could say something reasonable about the spatial distribution and probability of that event, you could do it. Where we've had conversations, for example, with one transit agency in the Midwest, where their biggest problem with climate change is actually not flooding. It's buckling of the rails. That every time it busts 90 degrees, you get rails that buckle, and whole hosts of people can't get to work because their T-stops are closed. Well, then they lose a lot of tax revenue because the commerce doesn't happen. So they wanted to look at possibly, tax revenue as the vulnerable asset. We've modeled that in many places, and published about it too. But it is that you could set it up that way and have the environmental threat would be in the shape of a line file, which is the T-track itself, and then you wouldn't have a depth damage function. You'd have a heat damage function on the track itself in different increments for likelihood of catastrophic failure, right? And then you can show those impacts versus having done something to protect against that happening, which is you could use what's called, there are many ways to set up a train track so that it's not vulnerable to temperature changes. They're expensive, and they've been asking, that T agency has been asking for a while, is this a good investment? It costs us $12 million. Well, if your vulnerable asset is tax revenue, let's do that cost-benefit relationship. Is it worth spending this $1,200 to be able to protect that tax revenue so people can get to work and still conduct that commerce? That's another way you could use this framework, but use your imagination. There are lots of ways, because it's generically neutral in that way, to just swap over to different assets and actions.
Great. So Sam, you mentioned that this is a tool that communities can download for free, and by the way, I'll send out all these links and contact information to everyone in the follow-up email. But I'm curious if you have a sense, Sam, for if a town wanted to run this model on their own, the amount of staff time, the level of expertise, how doable is this for a community to use on their own?
Well, my sense is that any town with a moderate amount of GIS expertise, like maybe a half-time GIS person, could handle this. And if they don't, they could find a local volunteer who was interested because it's innovative or novel. But even if they don't, it doesn't require a very sophisticated GIS. Again, it's self-standing. It's freestanding. You don't have to have Esri or ARC licensing or anything, because the output is KML files that go straight to Google Earth, and that's also free. So as long as people can run Google Earth and can follow the user's manual, they could do this. Now, that's not to say it's going to be easy, because there are, in fact, an awful lot of data massage issues on the front end. The assessor's tables don't tend to be in the standard format. The LiDAR and air photos might not be particularly available, and if they are, they may need a lot of massage. There can be an enormous number of sort of manipulating tasks for somebody to do on the front end. And the user's manual does not step people through how to do that because there's an infinity of those kinds of problems that might emerge. It requires creative and innovative people to do that, and that's one of the reasons that the very firm Catalysis exists, is to help that kind of thing happen. But much, much more than that, I need to say in response, is that, again, this is not about the technical tool. The people there, so that even the people who do figure it out and have 3GIS staff and they want to do it and become expert at cranking this thing and maybe even making their own depth damage functions and everything else, what do you do with the results? When you get into political process and community events, there are just an enormous number of very, very sensitive and tricky things around consensus building, around joint fact-finding, around mutual gains approaches, around values gaps that will emerge at the wrong times in the press and get people very angry, and people might lose their seats, political seats, if you go showing stuff that shows people are going to lose their property value before the certain right kind of stakeholder outreach has been done. And there are so many landmines to step on in doing this that, sure, anybody can go ahead and do this, but again, I think it's going to be an evolutionary process for society to be figuring out how to structure these interactions in a multi-stakeholder, ongoing fashion. And again, that is why I think there's the very firm we started has been having so much activity, because we've already done this so many times and have a pretty well established manner of helping people work through this in a way that's politically neutral, in a way that helps serve local particular political interests of just, trying to say, how are we going to respond to this?
Okay, so somewhat related, a follow-up question. What do you say to the community that says, this all sounds great, but I don't know how this process could possibly work in my community. People are too much in denial. The issue is too controversial. How do you start the process?
Well, we're experimenting with that. But, again, my earlier comment was about pushing rope. I mean, I had a paradigm shift as personally about 7 years ago, having spent 20 or 30 years as an environmentalist and doing all my research and other teaching and everything else, where I was writing legislation for people, doing whatever analysis, publishing. It was all with some good in mind, trying to make certain things happen. And I realized I don't need to try and convince people of anything anymore. And so I actually don't really go in and do terribly much trying to start processes to the question. I think that in a way, if people aren't ready, then they're not ready. Like, they come to us when they're wet enough or they're scared enough, and then we can really do something, because you've got that bolus of fear and uncertainty that is the resource that I'm saying you can convert to civic engagement. If you don't have that, then that resource isn't there. But that's not to say it's not possible if it isn't there, because and that's what I mean by we're experimenting. So, for example, I won't mention the place, but you could take a county-wide approach, and a county could hire us to do something neutral that's a straw person as a suite of results that would be presented to a suite of towns in their location that are intended to generate conversation. And everybody who would see those results in all the towns of that county would know that this is a straw person that is intended to burn, and we want all you townspeople who care about your stuff, who might be scared or who haven't had the conversation yet, any of these conversations, because it's too hard to start them, we want you to come to these meetings. And we brought in this outside neutral group that will facilitate all these discussions, and we're going to put you in the driver's seat. This is what empowerment truly is, in my view. It's putting people in the driver's seat and helping them make decisions about things that are important to them. And then they say, okay, yeah, we don't like those scenarios that you first came up with. We think there's going to be this much sea level rise or that much, or we're worried about storms this big, and we don't care about jobs as a vulnerable asset. We care about real estate. So we'll switch to that, and we'll structure it then in response to those towns that have showed up. Okay. Now that's one way to do it, so a county could come in and get it going in a way that's neutral for them. Remember, I made that point earlier about being political insurance, because they don't own anything. If it's a draft, they're just saying, here's something that starts a conversation. We're not saying you all are going to need to do anything. Just come on in and chat. And then the people who show up get to be in charge, and they're the ones who own the process.
Okay, that's great. It looks like we've gotten through our list of questions, unless there are any other final ones that folks want to chat in. Or Sam, if there's any final wrap-up comment you want to make. I'm assuming you're okay with my sending out your contact information and inviting people to send you questions as they occur to them.
Sure, of course. Anybody can contact me anytime about these things. So you mentioned one final wrap-up comment. I guess what I would say is my sense is that Hurricane Sandy really was a game changer. You know, I've been doing this work for an awful long time beforehand, and it was not long after Sandy that the phone calls started coming in. I almost stopped even needing to write proposals for this work because people would just say, can you start in 2 weeks? It's that there was a threshold about, remember that resource of fear and uncertainty being generated, that even if you weren't like Kingston and had just been clobbered, a lot of places are then scared, and that's something you can work with. And then also that what it is that people actually want, I think, and back to this question, great question I was just asked about how do you start the dialogues. I think what people want is simply an opportunity. They want a chance to have these really tough discussions because it's very tough to have them in other places. If anybody tries to have the discussion somewhere, it seems to almost immediately invoke the climate change specter, and if you hadn't noticed, we have a divided country on these matters, and it just blows up in your face right away. You can sidestep all of that and just have it be based on people's own, again, thresholds of risk tolerance. So that's the opportunity that's been missing, and what I think this provides is a way for people to perhaps choose to not simply allow destiny to wash over them, if you will, but instead to see that rising sea levels are perhaps, in fact, the troubles that we've been given, and that we could choose to instead face the bluntness of reality and perhaps produce a set of conversations and relationships between people, even if there are across political divides, that will create public process and policy results that are different from what we have unfortunately become accustomed to. And with that, I would say thank you very much.